Hi, everybody. My name is Joe Ricalto. I'm the Director of Public Policy and Government Relations for NMAC, and I welcome you to this week's webinar featuring on the topic of Census 2020 and redistricting. A couple of ground rules before we begin. First, everybody is in listen-only mode. However, if you have a question, we kindly ask that in the bottom right-hand screen, you'll see a chat tool. We ask that you type your questions there, and Chip Lewis, our comms director, will read the questions after the presentations have ended. At the end of the webinar, we're also going to be asking you to fill out a survey. For those that have joined us over the past 6-7 weeks, the survey is very useful to us as we gauge going forward on issues that are important to you and important to us. And so that said, I want to welcome you. Our presenters today will be David Frula, who's a partner with Kelly Dry, a firm here in DC that works on a pro bono basis for NMAC. They have a huge desire for social justice and change, and ending the HIV epidemic is part of that platform at Kelly Dry. David Frula is also part of the government relations team, and he heads Kelly Dry's partnership with NMAC. And so we welcome David. Also joining us in the second half of the presentation is Samia Norachanya. Samia is Director of Advocacy for the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, which is a group founded by former Attorney General Eric Holder, by which they act to have fair congressional, actually district lines throughout the country. And he's going to give us a pretty good presentation on why that matters. So with that said, I want to welcome David Frula first, as he begins the first half of the webinar on the census and why it's important. David?
Thank you, Joe, and I'm glad to be with you this afternoon. Wanted to provide some basic background about the census and about its purpose, its uses, and the protections it provides. There's understandably, in this day and age, a great deal of suspicion about the government, but what we wanted to do was explain to you, and so that you're able to be conversant with your communities about how the census operates and what the protections are, to try to make sure that you're getting useful, constructive information out there to the communities, because what we'll discuss as well is that responding matters, and it matters for programs that matter for you, and it matters, as Samia will explain, very, very much in terms of the apportionment of political power in the United States. So I think we're on to the first slide. The census goes back a long time. For those of you in the Christian tradition, in the book of Luke, Mary and Joseph were going to Bethlehem to take part in a census that was designed at that point to make sure that everyone was taxed. Bethlehem being the seat of the family of David. So that it goes back again to biblical roots. In the United States, we had a census even before we had a constitution. Our first census was in 1790. We have a little picture here for you of, some enumerators records from 1790. Next slide. The census, that first census was run by Thomas Jefferson, and it asked 6 questions. Actually, there are not that many more questions being asked today in the census. There are more parts to some of them, but there's still basic information being requested. And the census, again, it has roots in our Constitution. It's how representatives and taxes are apportioned. The Constitution provides for the census every 10 years. It runs on the 0 years. So 2020 is the next time that the census is up. And it's begun, as we'll discuss, it hasn't begun quite as smoothly as it might have without COVID-19, but it is well underway. Next slide. How does the process work? Beginning in mid-March, a letter should have come in the mail if you have a mailbox, and it would invite you to participate in the census. It provided information for you to respond online. You can respond online at 2020census.gov. You have to follow a link to get to the actual form. My2020census.gov takes you to the actual form. What the letter provides that isn't necessarily needed, and there's a bit of confusion about that because some folks are wanting to fill out the census and aren't home right now because of COVID. There is a 12-digit census ID form on the form that you can enter into the census form. You can, without that ID number, get in and fill out the census anyways. There have been some news reports of folks that, especially in New York, have left the city and have wanted to respond and weren't sure that they could, but they're able to just by going online. There'll be a few introductory questions, and the programming and the information is able to sort by address so they can take care of any potential duplication. But this is for the first time ever that the census is available principally online. There was a little bit of a dry run. There was kind of a hint in 2000 that you could go online to fill it out. But this is the time when really the census is migrated online. As of now, as of May 8th, the self-response rate nationwide is at 86 million households, about 58% of the population. So most of that has come online. You do have the option to either phone or mail in your census response. If you didn't respond online, then in mid-April, you should have gotten a paper form that you can fill out. There's also a number that you can call and respond. I'll just give you the English number, which is 844-330-2020. There are phone numbers for many, many different languages, which you can find on 2020census.gov. And if you don't respond by mail, if you don't phone in, if you don't respond online, at some point, an army of census workers will start fanning out across the country to try to visit houses individually and encourage folks to participate or to collect information. Given the COVID outbreak, this house-to-house canvass has been delayed. It should have been started already. They're planning to start it more toward the end of this month. With census workers will be given PPE. They'll still be going door to door. So if you've seen somebody saying they're a census worker already, they're not a census worker, but they will be coming the end of the month, and they should be in PPE. A couple other notes about COVID. The time period for the census to be completed originally was end of August. It ran from March 12th through August 31st. It's now running till Halloween. Because of COVID, there's more time to finish the whole census process. There are wrinkles now that you can read about in the press in terms of what's going on. You're supposed to count where you're living on April 1st. Some people are stuck away from home. They live where they live nonetheless. College kids are home. College kids are normally should be counted as in group living where they're in school, and there's processes for that because they don't ordinarily live at home. But there are a series of questions and issues sort of being raised by COVID. And again, there is an effort made to resolve as many of these issues as possible. And again, hopefully we will be able to get a good census count. Next slide, please. I think it's important also to understand what isn't collected. Information on citizenship, the administration had wanted to try to collect it. It's not being collected. There was a time actually when back in, I think, ending in the 50s, where citizenship information was collected. The efforts were struck down by the court. Political affiliation information, banking information, and Social Security information is also not collected. For the LGBTQ community, I think many of you were disappointed that there's no question about sexual orientation. There had been a draft being circulated for the census questions in 2017 that had, for a short time, included that. I know that's disappointing. I understand it, but at the same time, the census is tied to things that matter to you and your community, especially in the HIV/AIDS communities, and making sure that funding is available. One thing that is new this year is that same-sex households, whether married or living together, are accounted for the first time. Next slide. Can you refuse to participate? Well, you can skip questions, submit an incomplete census form, and still be included in the head count. But technically, if you're over 18 and refuse to answer the census, you can be fined $100. And if you give false answers, you can be fined $500. I don't know that that has ever been enforced, but that's what the law says. So there is a penalty there. As I said, it's rarely been enforced, though. Next slide, please. The census asked 9 questions. What I'd like to do, and I'm going to look away from the camera as I do this, is just to provide the rationale for the question that the government provides, just so you can get a better sense of why these questions are being asked. The first question is, how many people live in the house, apartment, or mobile home? That question is asked because the government wants to count the entire US population, where they live most of the time as of the census day. Are there any additional people living here? The goal is to count everyone who is living at that residence, including newborns, roommates, and those who are staying with you temporarily. A question is asked about whether you own the home, rent the home, whether it's an apartment or a mobile home, whether you have a mortgage. These statistics, or whether you rent, that's an indication of the nation's economy. It helps administer housing programs and planning and decision making in that regard. That's why the government does it. Don't expect that you're going to start to get junk mail from mortgage insurers if you answer that you have a mortgage. They do ask for the phone number, your phone number at the residence. The idea there is simply to have that phone number in case the Census Bureau has questions. It's designed for no purpose other than that. Next slide, please. The census will then ask questions about everybody living in your house. First and last name, sex, which is a male or female. Again, that's a limited age and date of birth. There's a question about whether an individual is of Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin. A series of different types of Hispanic origins are listed. There's also an other block. The following afterwards, there is a question about a person's race, which asks a different question than Hispanic or not, and gets into African American, Asian, Native, and there's also a place to add other. Those of Middle Eastern descent were disappointed when they had tried to get Middle Eastern included as a race, and that hadn't happened, but that is another point of controversy. You will identify a head of household, a person one. And then we talked about why these other questions are asked. And then what you do is for each person who fills out the census, you provide this information. And that's basically the census form, are those elements. For each person in the home, a little bit on the demographics of the home and how it's owned. A lot is done with that data, which we'll discuss. But let's talk for a few minutes about some of the factors influencing participation. Again, I realize there is sort of a basic distrust in many communities about the government. That may be one factor. Again, there are reasons that we'll explain why hopefully there are protections in place that will help mitigate that distrust and encourage participation. Some of the factors historically that have limited participation, households with young children are less likely to complete the census. Lower income households, households with high school education or less, non-English speakers, though there are provisions for non-English speakers. Renters often are less likely to fill it out. Large or mixed households, you can fill out the census on paper for up to 10 people. Above that, you need to fill it out online, but that may get to be a lot if you have a large or mixed household. Multifamily dwellings or large mobile home structures have also been a place where there's been difficulty with the counts over the years. And again, concerns about the confidentiality. But confidentiality is something that I would like to touch on. Next slide, please. Bottom line, it's against the law for any Census Bureau employee to disclose or publish any census information that identifies an individual. The data collected can only be used for statistical purposes that help make important decisions. There's a wrongful penalty of, far greater than the penalty for not responding for disclosing the census information. That's up to 5 years in jail. This information does not go to a law enforcement agency. It doesn't go to Homeland Security, ICE, FBI, or the CIA. They can't use the personal information by law that's collected via the census. Next slide, please. And again, as we've explained, in terms of how the data is shared, Census doesn't return the records to Homeland Security or ICE or any of its components. When the Census Bureau receives the records, and this is important as well, they're stripped of personal identifiable information and used for statistical purposes. Like I said, the phone number, that kind of information, a name is used more to follow up. The census itself is largely an address-based rather than a name-based system. Although the Census Bureau doesn't have routine data sharing arrangements with many federal, state, it does have routine data sharing arrangements through the federal government with Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid, HUD, and the IRS, although this information is not used to collect taxes. What is the data used for? That's the next slide. And this gets important. It's for federal grants, funds, and to support states, counties, and communities based on population totals. Detroit is a city that has historically been undercounted in 2000, based on the 2010 count, and what was missing in Detroit. Detroit's mayor estimates that the city lost out on $300 million of federal funding over a decade based on that undercount, the relative undercount. So money is at stake. I just was looking at researching for this program a paper in the Rio Grande Valley in Texas where, as might not surprise you, some of the more rural counties, they're having a hard time counting. They were estimating that it was $1,500 a year per person of government revenues that you would lose for each person who didn't respond. So it's real money. Altogether, the census and information used in the census accounts for federal spending of $675 billion per year is divided up based on how the census is responded to. So making sure that you're counted, that gets the money allocated to you and to your communities. The census data can be, when it's stripped and aggregated, businesses use it to make planning decisions. Local government use it for public safety and emergency preparedness. It can be available to residents for community initiatives as well. Next slide. Samia will spend a good portion of time discussing redistricting in the interest of complete, and I'm really glad that he's here to provide you that background. In the interest of completeness, congressional representation is based on the census. Congressional representation also makes up electoral college representation. So it matters not just for the House of Representatives, but ultimately for the presidency. Next slide. We've talked about the federal funding programs, about 126 programs when a count was done. Federal programs use census data. The top 20 included medical assistance, the SNAP program, supplemental nutrition assistance was number 2. National School Lunch was on the top 10. Head Start was up there. The WIC program, Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for Women, Infants, and Children. So many of the programs that LIHEAP is there. Many of the programs that disadvantaged communities have come to rely on. The census data is how those funds are divided up. So responding is important for that reason as well. And there are, and this will be my final slide before I turn it over to Samia. Next slide, please. HIV/AIDS programs that also the funding is based on census. The substance abuse and prevention and treatment block grants, about $2 billion are allocated by state by census. HIV emergency relief project grants, Ryan White Title I, that's about $700 million. HOPWA is about, at that time, it was about $370 million. And then other preventative health and health services block grants were another $160 million. So there are very good reasons for participating in the census, and there are protections there to make sure that the data is used appropriately. That's what I have for you on the introduction. And with that, I will turn it over to Samia Narachania from the National Democratic Redistricting Committee. It's great that Samia is here to provide some information that really, I think, and will bring home to you why this matters politically.
Great.
Samia?
Thank you, David. Thank you all for having me. I just want to confirm, can folks both see me, hear me, and see my screen as well?
Yes.
Perfect. So I just want to, again, thank you all for having me. Very excited to be here. I wanted to talk a little bit about redistricting, what it is, why it matters, and how we go about the process. So as David said, the census happens every 10 years in the year ending in 0. And following the census, states are then tasked with redrawing their congressional, their state legislative, and other district boundaries as well. in order to ensure equal and proportional representation. This is redistricting. Very simple, very easy, and it is about, at the end of the day, political power. David showed a Brennan Center graphic in his slide deck that also talked about apportionment, which is part of this. So as you count in the census, the notion of one person, one vote means that you should have equal districts of equal size across states in order to ensure that everybody has the same amount of political power. Now, there are ways in which this has been manipulated in the past. There's a very famous way in which it has been manipulated, which is the three-fifths compromise, in which slaves only counted as 3/5 of a person for purposes of the census, and therefore counted as less than a person. However, did add to the overall political power of Southern slaveholding states, because as their population went up, those people, their quote unquote population went up, even though slaves did not have voting rights or any other rights. They were still counted in a way in which places like Georgia or places like Alabama could have more political representation through apportionment. And that's one way that maps are manipulated. Another way that this process is manipulated is through gerrymandering. So what is gerrymandering? Gerrymandering is a form of cheating, plain and simple, that allows a political party, a group, a racial group, any group that allows folks to gain power without actually winning the majority of votes in their state. So politicians often gerrymander in the redistricting process to establish a political advantage. States have to redistrict, but they do not have to gerrymander. Gerrymandering is the bad version of what is good and lawful and necessary, which is redistricting. Because if redistricting were to happen in a fair manner, then what you end up having is like true justice, an actual place where people are represented and have the same political power and the same political voice. So to boil that down, what that means is redistricting allows voters to choose their representatives freely, and gerrymandering allows representatives to choose their voters, so that they then no longer feel accountable, and the bodies that they serve in are no longer responsive to the people that they serve. So that's what the problem is in a nutshell. If you have co-opted or taken over the redistricting process to gerrymander, you no longer are accountable to your voters. And this is what that looks like in practice. Took three pretty egregious examples here. But if you look at, for example, North Carolina. In North Carolina, 51% of the statewide vote went to the Republican Party. However, Republicans gained 77% of the seats in that election. And so they've built in an inherent advantage of about 26 percentage points, which is quite the lot there in terms of translating votes into seats. There are more egregious examples, for example, in Wisconsin, where the Republican Party received less than half of the votes, but nearly 2/3 of the seats. So when that happens, what you're doing is you're cracking and you're packing communities of interest, communities of color, historically disadvantaged communities into districts at the expense of their political power. So an example that isn't on here that I like to point to is Texas. In Texas, the city of Austin is split up into 6 different districts. One of those districts connects to San Antonio, and that district is represented by a Democrat. The other 5 districts in Austin split the city up and then incorporate some suburbs, but a lot of rural areas of Texas as well. And those 5 districts are all represented by Republicans. In Houston, you've got Houston cracked, I believe, into 5 different or 7 different districts. And when you think about what that means, is if the majority of the voters of one district come from the rural area, but you're including just a small slice of the urban area, you're really diminishing the voice and the power of those urban priorities in that district. And if I represented that district, I would feel accountable potentially to the rural voters and not at all to the block of voters who are urban, even though they exist in greater quantity overall. Their political power has been split into 5 or 6 or 7 different districts. And if, for example, public health was of a concern for them because they live in denser areas, because there are more essential jobs that are happening in the middle of a pandemic, if folks have to use public transportation, I, as a representative, I'm not incentivized to pay attention to those things, even though those people live in my district, because only 1/5 of them live in my district. And under that scenario, I now have an incentive to not only not pay attention to them, but potentially pay attention to the special interests who care about other priorities that aren't them. And that's where this manipulation really runs into trouble. And so, to talk about it more plainly, 2018 was widely seen as a wave election for the Democratic Party. But because of the inherent advantage of gerrymanders in our current system, and I'm not here to say that only Republicans gerrymander, Democrats have historically gerrymandered as well. But in 2010, the technology really took gerrymandering to a new level because you could put big data behind it and really slice up districts in ways and with a precision that you have never seen before. And that precision led to, even in a wave election, the GOP winning about 16 more House seats than the votes would expect, and hold on to 7 full state legislative chambers that would have otherwise flipped parties. And the reason that is important, and I don't need to say this to this group, is because of public policy making. It is different and easier if you are able to get the ear of the elected officials that you need to lobby. And if you are trying to get money towards HIV/AIDS prevention or HIV/AIDS research, knowing that your elected official is responsive to that need rather than to protecting their flank and taking a big check from pharmaceuticals, for example, as opposed to the folks in their district, is important. And knowing that there is a threat of voting somebody out is important for somebody to have an incentive to actually take that seriously, as opposed to thinking about taking a check from pharmaceuticals, from the gun lobby, from whoever, in order to protect their flank. So that's the problem more. And so one thing to keep in mind is gerrymandering can seem like a pretty wonky topic, but it has really gotten traction lately, I think, because of how hyper gerrymandered our districts have been in the last 10 years. And voters are concerned about it. It is something that people know about, and they automatically think about gerrymandering as bad. They understand that partisan gerrymandering is part of what they understand to be a broken system of government and of democracy. And so it is not something that's like sort of academic or ethereal. People have an understanding that this is affecting their day-to-day life in some way. Maybe they can't fully put what that is, pen to paper, but they know it exists, they know it is bad, and they'd like to do something about it. And so that gets me to how maps are drawn and how to take action. So redistricting, again, happens every 10 years. It happens in the year after the census. Right now, the census is happening. They've asked for a couple of delays given the COVID-19 epidemic. And so redistricting will be impacted by those delays. And we're trying to figure out exactly how that is and what states will be affected. For sure, some states with state constitutional deadlines will be affected. States with other statutory deadlines will be affected. Virginia and New Jersey will be affected because they hold elections in 2021. But maps are drawn in 2021, and they either happen by commissions or by state legislators. Now, on the whole, commissions are a better way to draw maps because you're taking the pen out of people with self-interest in drawing a district for themselves. Independent commissions are obviously better than non-independent commissions. So you're talking about citizen-led, no politicians, and those, you've got gold standards in places like California and Arizona for those sorts of commissions. But at the same time, you do have places where legislators are going to be involved in drawing maps. And if you want to see progress on issues that are important to you, you have to be involved in the redistricting process, and you have to talk to the folks who are drawing the maps. There will be, in a lot of places, public comments on maps, public hearings on maps, opportunities for folks to voice what is important in a community. For example, that Austin should remain as whole as possible and shouldn't be split into 6 different districts, or that Houston or Philadelphia or all these different urban areas should remain as whole as possible because they are communities of interest, right? And then not just at the city level, but at levels like race, that this is a historically African-American community that shouldn't be cracked. There's a good example in North Carolina where under a redraw, an HBCU, in fact, the largest HBCU, North Carolina A&T, was split in half between 2 congressional districts. So showing how places should be kept intact in order to preserve that political power will be really important in these public engagement opportunities, whether it is a commission state or a state legislative state. And those, again, those opportunities will include hearings, will include public comment periods. It means talking to your legislators directly and lobbying them directly. It means taking advantage of call tools, other things that we'll be doing overall. And I'd be happy to connect folks to those resources as we move forward. But that is all going to be happening in 2021, and we'll set the maps basically for the next decade, from 2021 to 2031. And so that is all I have. I do know that I'm sure that there are folks with questions, so I don't want to take up too much time, but I appreciate y'all having me on and look forward to any questions people have.
Samia, thank you very much. That was very informative, and the work that you and your colleagues under the direction of General Holder at the NDRC are doing is vitally important to make more and more Americans aware of the horrific redistricting agenda here going on. And David, thank you for your very intelligent and straightforward presentation on the census. I think you nailed it right on the head quite nicely with how it matters, the financial impact that it will have on the communities that NMAC serves, but more importantly, all of us here on this call that have a stake in minority-based healthcare and the deliverance of that. Throughout these 2 presentations, we've asked you to type your questions in the chat box. And Chip, if we have any questions, I don't know, do we have questions, Chip, that for either Dave or Sonia?
We do. Can you hear me all right?
I can.
Okay. First question I have is, how do people get involved in their community on redistricting?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it really depends on the state as to what those opportunities would be. But I'm happy to connect with folks and get them connected to local redistricting tables that exist in their states, or other organizations, C3, C4, or otherwise, that are working on the issue. But again, it is a matter of actually talking, not just to your membership and have them know about this, but having your members as well as yourselves talking to your elected officials and being engaged in the process if there are transparency requirements in the process in your state. This, again, is a very state by state sort of process. So in that vein, if there is an opportunity to show up to a public hearing, or to do public comment, or to even draw maps, there are states where public maps are taken into consideration. I'd be happy to sort of get you in contact with the folks who are looking at those particular pieces.
Samia, on that end, and David, for you as well, is it okay to share your email with the participants on today's webinar?
Yeah, that's not a problem at all.
Okay. Chip, next question.
Okay. You still hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. Next question. Are all family members required to fill out a census?
No, one family member fills out the census, person number one, and that person fills it out for everybody living in the household as of April 1st.
Okay. Next question. Is there a guarantee that names and any other qualifiers are not disclosed?
The guarantee is the legal requirements. Beyond that, and the way the data is used and has been used historically, I don't know that there's any other guarantee that can be provided.
Yeah, just to jump in, the guarantee is in fact the law, right? It is illegal for the census to share that data with any other agency. So I understand that there is a trust issue with the government, especially in the current time. But there is, I think it is important to hammer home the fact that it is in fact illegal for the Census Bureau to share that data with any other agency.
Okay, next question. Why historically have minorities been left out?
They've historically been left out in part because they haven't responded to the census for a variety of reasons, whether that's fear or education or having a less stable residence. There has been historically an effort to canvass every place, but people still do fall through the cracks.
Yeah, I think it's important to acknowledge the structural aspect of the census, right? It depends upon forms of communication and systems that are built upon and continue to build upon white power. And so not in any bad way, but in the structural way that, for example, the first census counted mainly African slaves as 3/5 of people. So the undercount is built into the census, or had been from the start. And on top of that, there is not just distrust of government, but there has been purposeful or otherwise structural disadvantages that minorities often face. It is why there are health disparities for minorities, or environmental disparities for minorities. The same is true for the census, in that it is harder to count the folks who do not have a political voice. And the way to rectify that is to give those folks more of a political voice. But in order to do so, they must be counted. So it is a bit of a catch-22, and it is why both of these issues are really, really important. And it is why communicating with the right message and the right messengers is really important.
Yep, next question.
Okay, sure. So for people who have elderly parents, can I fill out the census form for them if needed?
Yes. You would fill it out for them depending upon their residence and answer as if you were them.
All right. Next question. Can a healthcare proxy fill out the census for someone?
I don't think there's any legal requirement that would prevent a healthcare proxy from filling out a survey for an individual who was who needed the help.
Okay, next question. Can you replace sex with transgender on the census form without getting into legal trouble?
I don't believe there's a way to do that.
If they cross it out, David?
I doubt you'd get in legal trouble. In fact, I'm 100% sure you wouldn't. I think they're grateful for the answers.
Can a census worker report a suspected undocumented individual?
No.
Okay. So I'm trying to read this question. Does the fact that DC and other territories not have voting representation in Congress matter because there are no congressional lines? I'm saying that means there are no congressional districts in the territories.
Right. Yeah. Yes and no. I'm not familiar with redistricting in all of the territories, but for example, in DC, there is still redistricting that happens, even though it is not at the congressional level, right? There's ward level redistricting that would be important, and ANC level redistricting that would be important. And so it's not just at the congressional federal level at which people have representation. Obviously, that is an important one and one that should be rectified, in my opinion. But at the same time, just as state legislatures exist and need to have equitable representation between their residents, territories like DC, and I'm sure others that I'm less familiar with, do need to create the opportunity for one person, one vote at the ward level, at the ANC level, at some of those local levels. Just as, some places have school boards that have districts that need to be redrawn.
Okay, I think we have one more question. Where are the biggest challenges and where should we target our efforts?
So I think that's probably both David and myself. David, do you want to take the census side?
I mean, on the census side, I think I would go back to the information on the slide that, let me just, the factors influencing participation and focus on historically folks that have been undercounted, households with young children, lower income households, households with less education, large or mixed households, renters, non-English speakers, multifamily dwellings, or large mobile homes, places where there's been, where you would expect in minority communities there to be an historic distrust. In large part, it's getting people familiar and comfortable filling out a form. Again, this starts online. Online is not necessarily available to everybody. The census workers do go out, but you are collecting and conveying information in a format, and that can be both complicated if you're dealing with a fairly dense or diverse living arrangement, and it also can be daunting if you're not an English speaker or are distrustful or may have less education. So I think you sort of focus on those factors that have historically diminished participation and go from there.
Yeah, I agree completely with David, right? It is a lot of places that have been historically underrepresented that have the most need, especially on the census count. And then in terms of priority areas for redistricting, it's places that are at the federal level, at least, gaining or losing a congressional seat are obviously going to be very important, because changing the map to that extent, when you have to add in a whole new seat or take out a couple of seats, places like Texas, places like Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, these Arizona, those are really important states to sort of take a look at as we move forward. Places that have rapid population growth or population decreases are going to be important. And then just from a political perspective, it's places where, you know, folks have, there are communities that could really make it so that progress could be achieved in the next 10 years, but are being, for whatever reason, disadvantaged politically. And this is one opportunity to make sure that they are put on an equal playing field moving forward.
Chip, any more questions?
No, that's it.
Great. Couple closing remarks first, David and Samia, thank you again. The slides that they both presented, we'll make them available on NMAC's website, nmac.org. And following the closure here, we're going to ask those that participated in today's webinar, if you have time to fill out the survey that NMAC will be using to gauge this response as well as future webinars. And this is certainly an eye-opening webinar on the importance of both the census and gerrymandering. So David and Samia, thank you, and thank you, Chip, and thank you everybody else. Please be safe, and we will see you next Thursday. Thank you.
Take care.